I'm Catherine McGrady, the CEO of CNA, and this is CNA Talks. In this podcast, our experts discuss current events, policies, and research that impact our nation's security.
Episode 111. I'm John Stimson with CNA's Office of Communications. In this episode, we explore a recent CNA report covering the role of China's People's Liberation Army in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and what insights this gives us into their global capabilities. Well, I'm very lucky to have two great CNA analysts with me today to discuss today's topic. First, we have Heidi Holz. She is a senior research scientist with CNA's China Studies program. Thanks for being on again, Heidi. Great to have you.
It's my pleasure, John. Happy to be here.
And we also have Waidelich. He is a research scientist with CNA's Indo-Pacific Security Affairs program. Welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Great to be here, John.
We're here today to talk about your new report on the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA's, role in managing the COVID-19 pandemic and initial outbreak in the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. So just to get things started here, I think that people might be surprised to hear that a military organization like the People's Liberation Army is involved in healthcare issues like this at all. So I wanted to ask you guys to get into a bit of the scope of the PLA. Is it more than a military organization in China?
That's an interesting question to start with, because for us as students of the Chinese military, this is something that we're very used to seeing them doing, to being mobilized to deal with domestic crises, everything from floods, landslides, things like that, to health crisis like this. The PLA played a prominent role in managing the SARS outbreak in 2002, 2003. So it actually isn't surprising from a PLA watcher's perspective that they were heavily involved in the domestic response to COVID-19.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Is the PLA, by responding to a health crisis, doing something beyond the scope of an ordinary military? And what I'd argue is that this is something that a lot of modern militaries in the world do, which is respond to military operations other than war. That includes health crises. It also includes things like natural disasters. It's a mission set, really, that the PLA has taken on much more in the past couple decades. Prior to the current leader of China, Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, the previous leader, called on the PLA to embrace its new historic mission. And those included a shift of resources to more of these military operations other than war, in an effort to greater protect China's interests both home and abroad. So as Heidi mentioned, we did see the PLA responding to the SARS outbreak, and we also saw them responding to the Ebola outbreak in Africa as well. So this is kind of the third major iteration of the PLA responding to a big health emergency in which it's being mobilized not just to do tasks such as quarantining or responding to the people getting these infections, but also developing treatments or vaccines.
Just to make sure we have a full picture of what the response looked like, can you contextualize PLA's role in this compared to like China's civilian organizations?
Sure. There are a couple things to keep in mind when thinking about the PLA's role in responding to the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic domestically within China. And the first is that the PLA efforts were really part of a larger civilian-led response. So the PLA wasn't in charge of responding to COVID-19 within China. It was a response that was led by civilian coordinating bodies that were specifically established for the purpose of dealing with the pandemic under the State Council. The second thing to keep in mind is that the PLA medical personnel who were sent to Wuhan to deal with the initial outbreak constituted a small fraction of the total number of medical professionals who were sent. So I think the total number, according to officially published statistics, was something in the neighborhood of 42,500 medical professionals sent to Wuhan. Only about 4,000 of those were from the People's Liberation Army.
So it's very clearly it was a support role
Exactly.
You mentioned these offices were set up specifically for the purposes of dealing with COVID-19. Do we know what they're called?
Yeah, we identified a couple. There was the State Council Joint Prevention and Control Mechanism, which was an ad hoc civilian organization designed to coordinate the response across different bureaucratic stovepipes within the Chinese system. And then there was a central leading small group for responding to the novel coronavirus epidemic. Leading small groups are another type of ad hoc coordinating body that the Chinese system will establish to ensure a coordinated whole of government response.
In the case of China and how it thinks about responding to emergencies, including public health emergencies, there's an extensive set of plans that go from the national level down to the local government levels that detail who is responsible for what civilian organizations, how, in theory, they should interface with military counterparts and how they should all work together to respond to these. But what you see in practice is when something like COVID comes up, there are these temporary bodies established at the national level, like the State Council mechanism that Heidi mentioned. So there's a mix of these plans, but also these things that are thrown together in the actual event to make sure that all of these resources are being mobilized and people are getting what they need.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you both very much for that context. So you identified 4 different areas where the PLA was involved in COVID relief. The first was sending personnel and supplies to Wuhan in the immediate aftermath of the outbreak. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So a couple of days after China acknowledged that it had a pandemic or epidemic crisis on its hands, the PLA was mobilized to get personnel and supplies sent to Wuhan, which was at the time the epicenter of the pandemic. And what we saw from observing the media reporting of this event was that the PLA sent 3 waves of medical personnel to Wuhan. These waves consisted of medics and doctors from various services and forces within the PLA, as well as medical equipment and supplies needed for the response. And these waves of personnel and equipment all arrived within several weeks of the outbreak. And once they arrived in Wuhan, they first embedded themselves within existing civilian hospitals, playing a supporting role to the civilian medics who were responding to the patients and the caseloads. But then by the time the second wave arrived, China had built these makeshift hospitals specially designed to treat the large numbers of COVID patients. And we saw at that point, as the second wave of a couple thousand personnel from the PLA was coming in, they were transferred to these makeshift hospitals and they were given management authority over them. So that was a point at which we saw the PLA moving away, for the most part, from the civilian hospitals and being separated to, in that case, bear the brunt of the COVID patients.
I just wanted to take a step back and explain how we identified those 3 waves. In the report, there's actually a graphic that shows the waves, and it's actually kind of visually stunning to see how personnel and aid flowed from all parts of China into Wuhan in those first few weeks. But the way we identified those waves was by taking a step back and looking at Chinese media reporting on, say, the PRC Ministry of National Defense's website to identify a timeline of major events that took place from the initial recognition by Xi Jinping at the national level that there was indeed an outbreak in Wuhan and the call to the rest of the country to respond and to the PLA to respond. And then from that point forward, we compiled a very detailed timeline of events using predominantly Chinese media reporting. And it was when we sat down and analyzed that timeline that we realized that there were these 3 major waves of aid into Wuhan in those initial weeks.
Yeah, and perhaps one thing to add onto what Heidi's already said, that being there is a several week gap in between the time at which Chinese doctors in China were beginning to realize that they had a serious health crisis on their hands, and the time at which Chinese authorities, led by Xi Jinping, publicly acknowledged the COVID-19 pandemic. So to just make that timeline clear, it was late December 2019 at which the doctors in Wuhan were beginning to realize something was wrong. And it was January 2020 at which the PRC leadership went public. And that was when all of the mobilization really kicked off within China.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one thing that we don't have visibility on is that, that several week gap before the national level authorities decided to go public and acknowledge that there was an outbreak in Wuhan.
And is the reason for that gap because of state control of the media, meaning that this wasn't being reported, or just because of there just wasn't that much attention on the issue at all?
There was an effort to really control information coming out of Wuhan in those weeks while the national level authorities tried to figure out how to respond.
So moving to your next item here, the PLA was involved in developing a vaccine. Can you speak about that topic?
Sure. So, one of the PLA's major lines of effort in response to COVID-19 was this development of a vaccine. And there was a team of medical researchers led by a PLA Major General, Major General Chen Wei, that arrived in Wuhan, within a week of the initial acknowledgement that there was an outbreak in Wuhan. And they arrived to begin work on a vaccine and potential cures. And less than 2 months later, their vaccine was approved for clinical trials in China. And by June, it had been approved for use among military personnel.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that Chen Wei was actually there in Wuhan with a lot of the other first responders from the PLA. But she and her team were kind of isolated from the main group who were responding to those patients. And in the beginning, there wasn't a lot of news about Chen Wei in the Chinese press. It was actually very difficult months later to find any mention. But as soon as she and her team started to have what looked like a bit of success in developing this vaccine, then she became a huge news story in the Chinese media. And in fact, months later, I believe, when she successfully had some of those clinical trials, you actually saw a ceremony in which Xi Jinping was presenting a medal to Chen Wei on behalf of her and her team. So the amount of visibility that this vaccine development had in the Chinese press can really not be overstated.
Another interesting point is that the team led by Chen Wei was one of the first in the world to publish results in a peer-reviewed journal that showed that a coronavirus vaccine could be safe and capable of eliciting an immune response. That was a big good news story in the Chinese press.
I don't remember hearing about Pfizer's until October in terms of even the clinical trial stage, never mind actual use.
It's a good news story in that respect that they came up with something quickly and they showed it to be safe and capable of eliciting an immune response. But, it bears noting that despite how quickly they were able to develop that particular vaccine, it still hasn't received widespread approval outside of China. Back in October of last year, it was the most recent data that was available, only about 10 countries were allowing entry to travelers who had had that particular vaccine. So it didn't necessarily receive widespread use or approval. And as of the end of January of this year, it hadn't yet been approved for use by the World Health Organization.
I remember reading a little bit about that, and also how I don't believe the vaccines from the United States have received approval for distribution within China, despite the fact that I believe the efficacy numbers are higher on the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine.
Well, I think that one of the other important things to note is that China still has not changed its policy toward responding to COVID. Even as we're recording this podcast now, because of the low efficacy of its own vaccine, it continues to have a zero tolerance COVID policy in which if one person within a city tests positive, they're going to shut down that city for a week or more. And we saw this recently in Shanghai. So the low efficacy of that vaccine is continuing to have important policy implications for China domestically, and as well as internationally, because China is still not opened up to foreign visitors in the way that many countries with more effective vaccines have.
And it's very socially and economically disruptive.
Mm-hmm. So the last two items you guys have here are the providing aid and medical support to other countries and providing vaccines to other countries. Is there like a significant distinction between how the PLA operated in these two cases, or is it comparable?
Well, it was more just a transition over time. So in March 2020, right about when, Xi Jinping seemed to signal that they'd conquered the outbreak in Wuhan, the PLA started to deliver aid to other countries overseas that were battling their own outbreaks. And in the following 11 months, because there were not yet vaccines to deliver, they donated aid to more than 50 countries around the world. The scope of it was actually pretty astounding. And the materials that they delivered included ventilators, test kits, masks, and other personal protective equipment, or PPE. And where they went to 50 countries, I can't say exactly how much aid they donated to each. We didn't do a quantitative analysis. But for the following 11 months, they really focused on delivering those types of materials. But as soon as they had vaccines to deliver, there was a transition to vaccine diplomacy, whereby the PLA was delivering vaccines to other countries.
One thing to add to what Heidi already said is that the reason we didn't do quantitative analysis is because a lot of this data is very qualitative. The media reporting from the PRC regarding the donations or delivery of medical supplies or vaccines to other countries often is very vague and does not have a lot of detail about what is actually being donated in terms of quantity or specific items. What I will say to that is that we were able to identify a number of instances in which the PLA itself, with Air Force aircraft, was transporting these supplies or medical personnel or vaccines to countries in Asia, countries in Africa, and we've noted those in our report. It was interesting to see how far the PLA got at some points in physically delivering this aid. The PLA Air Force historically has not operated very far beyond China's own borders. And what we did see in this case was a number of countries that received aid via PLA Air Force aircraft, such as the Y-20. And this was an interesting finding for us as PLA watchers who don't normally see that kind of activity. And it also made us consider how logistically the PLA might be pulling this off. Because if you look at the publicly reported capabilities of the Y-20, the PLA Air Force's long-range transport aircraft, it does not have the ability to fly directly to some of the countries in Africa where it was delivering aid. And this raises questions about the types of agreements that China has with countries in between, countries perhaps in the Middle East or South Asia, to allow the PLA to stop over and refuel, and whether those are ad hoc arrangements or whether those are more formal agreements and what those entail.
Just how much of it has to do with the fact that this was an aid mission and not, strictly a military mission? Would it be different were it not an aid mission?
Exactly. I think you're right on point. It raises questions about those. And obviously, we don't have the scenario yet to test that. We don't have a China at war. But at the very least, it does illustrate that there are some sorts of agreements between China and the countries in the region, and they are being put into play for these kinds of non-war activities. I would add that in addition to the PLA Air Force activity we saw in response to the COVID pandemic, we also recently saw the PLA Air Force flying long range to deliver disaster relief supplies in Tonga after the volcanic eruption that took place earlier this year. And that was another case in which you really saw the PLA Air Force flying far beyond the range of its aircraft, and in that case, actually stopping over 3 times on its way. There was not any public reporting at the time on where it stopped over, but later some other media organizations identified a couple of those countries. And that was actually something that CNA covered in its in-depth series.
I'd just like to follow up on that because this was one of the most interesting findings in our report, at least to me as a PLA watcher. I remember in 2011 when the PLA evacuated Chinese citizens from Libya. And it was the first use of a long range aircraft to rescue PRC citizens from a conflict zone, or a long range PLA aircraft. So it was not a common thing for the PLA to fly overseas, as Brian just mentioned. So to see that the PLA aircraft delivered aid to at least 20 countries. And as Brian mentioned, we're not exactly sure where they were stopping to refuel, though it is likely that they needed to refuel to reach some of their destinations, particularly in Africa. And maybe there were agreements in place with the countries in which they stopped. Regardless, these deliveries of aid to at least 20 different countries provided them with an opportunity to gain valuable operational experience in other countries, operating, landing, and refueling at foreign airfields. This was a very significant takeaway for us.
And one thing that comes to mind, Heidi, as I hear you guys talk about this is, on our last episode of CNA Talks, we talked about how China's Arctic investments could all fundamentally be seen as like a dual use civilian military investment. And that seems to apply here as well, where we don't know exactly which countries, but presumably a country in Central Asia or the Middle East.
That would be a logical hypothesis. It would bear testing. I would very much like to know more about where they stopped, where they refueled, but I don't have those answers right now.
I appreciate that.
So just adding on to Heidi's point, one place we can probably rule out in terms of where the PLA did its stopovers on its way to African countries is the PLA's base in Djibouti, which is the Chinese military's only overseas military base. If you look at public reporting about the runway that is on that base, it's simply too short and not suited for the takeoff and landing of military transport aircraft. So we can safely assume that these stopovers were taking place somewhere else.
That's interesting because, yes, that would, of course, be one of the first thoughts that people would come to, would be that they would be making use of the existing military base. I wanted to move to the last insight that you list in your report, and that's that several aspects of the PLA's response demonstrated a jointness. I understand that one of the goals of the PLA has been to replicate the United States' military joint operation doctrine. Can you speak to the point of jointness a bit and how this demonstrated that?
One of the ways that we saw so-called jointness in the PLA's response to the pandemic was the way in which it was being led within the PLA, and that was through the Joint Logistics Support Force. This is a force that was set up in 2016 in the context of the PLA's broad-ranging reforms. And its objective is to really unify the combat logistics support within the PLA that was previously spread out among different services. So it's supposed to be unifying those capabilities, including the medical system, to respond to these sorts of crises or wartime operations. Another way that we saw jointness was the way in which the PLA Air Force was being used to transport medical personnel and supplies from a variety of other services and forces. Basically, every major part of the PLA, whether it's the Navy or the Army or the Rocket Force, their medical personnel were being involved in this response effort. And the PLA Air Force was playing a key facilitating role in getting them where they needed to be.
I would just add a little bit of context to what Brian said, and that is for the listeners, many are probably aware that in late 2015, the Chinese military embarked on a series of sweeping reforms, and those reforms were aimed at making it a more modern joint fighting force. And as Brian mentioned, it included the establishment of the JLSF, or the Joint Logistics Support Force. And one of the things that was so interesting to us from the perspective of research analysts is that COVID-19 posed the real first test of this new organization that was set up to unify PLA logistics.
That's really interesting. I guess having this first test of this new logistical unification system being what is largely an aid and domestic response project, I imagine that while we can take a lot of really valuable information from this, it doesn't necessarily give us a complete picture of how the PLA would be able to operate during warfare. Did your report explore what gaps we could observe from that?
There are a few major gaps that we do need to think about in comparing the PLA's response to COVID to a potential wartime situation in the future. One of those is obvious, and it's just that the types of cases that the PLA medical personnel are treating in the case of a pandemic are going to be different than a wartime situation. If they are responding to combat, then they're going to be treating different types of wounds. They're going to be potentially operating in situations where they are under threat from enemy action. So it really affects not only the type of treatment they give, but how they maneuver and the types of support that they can receive. But another area, and this gets more to the analytic process, is in our analysis of the PLA's response to COVID, we were relying largely on PRC media reporting, which is inherently biased and limited. So there are some instances in which we were able to identify PRC media or PLA subject matter experts writing in academic journals where they were admitting flaws and weaknesses in the PLA's response to COVID. But those are usually very qualitative and probably overlooking a lot of the messiness that accompanies any response to a disaster or an emergency. So I did just want to address the limited data that we were working with and how that does inform how confident we can be about the capability of the PLA's medical system overall.
We're still too close to COVID-19 for there to have been a lot written on this yet. For purposes of comparison, Chinese analysts were writing about SARS for a decade afterward, trying to sort out the lessons learned. And we can expect to see similar internal discussions with China for years to come, trying to sort out the lessons learned from the response to COVID-19 and what they could do better the next time around. And the best place to look for that type of information is in the professional journals, which are really for, Chinese analysts having conversations among themselves about how to do things better. The other thing that I would know, Brian mentioned that the types of capabilities that would be required during a combat situation would be different, which is absolutely true. But the infection control and quarantine operations that you see in response to COVID-19 would potentially be relevant to handling nuclear, chemical, and biological attacks. So there are probably some more lessons to be drawn from that. It would be another line of analysis that I'd be happy to go down, but that we just raised that potential in the paper. That's a topic for further research.
Yeah, and more work for you guys, I suppose.
Happy to do it.
That's all the time we have today. Brian and Heidi, I want to thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, John. My pleasure.
Thanks so much, John.
The report is RxPLA, the PLA medical system's role in China's efforts to fight COVID-19. We'll have a link to it in our show notes if you'd like to learn more. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on CNA Talks. Thanks for listening to CNA Talks. The views expressed are those of the commentators and do not necessarily reflect those of CNA or any of its sponsors. CNA Talks is produced, edited, and mixed by John Stimson. Our theme music is by Edward Gringa. If you enjoy our show, we'd love if you could give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.